The journey begins. The rain was falling gently over the city when Sundar Pichai pulled up in front of a small, modest apartment building. It was early morning, the streets still wet and glistening from the night showers. Inside his car, Sundar sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the building, as if it held a secret only he knew. His heart felt heavier than usual today, though he couldn't exactly say why. In the passenger seat, his mother sat quietly, looking out the window. She was wearing a simple shawl around her shoulders, her silver hair tied neatly in a bun. Her face was calm, but there was something in her eyes, a distant sadness, like she was traveling through memories only she could see. "Amma," Sundar said, softly, breaking the silence. "Are you ready?" She turned her head slowly and smiled, though it was a smile tinged with nostalgia. "I'm ready, Kana," she replied, using the Tamil word for my dear. Her voice was gentle, but Sundar could hear the weight beneath it. Today was not an ordinary day. Today, Sundar was taking his mother back to the house she had been born in, a house she had not seen in over 50 years. The idea had come to him a few months ago, after she had shared a story from her childhood. It was about a mango tree that once stood in their courtyard, where she and her siblings would spend hours playing, laughing, and dreaming. Her voice had cracked when she said she didn't know if it still stood, or if the house even existed anymore. That memory had stayed with Sundar. He had decided without telling her that he would find the place. He wanted to give her the chance to see it again, to touch those memories before time swallowed them completely. And so, after weeks of searching, making calls, and quietly arranging everything, he had told her the night before that they would be going on a trip. He had not told her where. Now, as he pulled away from the building and drove toward the edge of the city. The roads became narrower, lined with old shops and half-forgotten houses. His mother glanced at him every now and then, curious, but didn't ask questions. She trusted him completely. Sundar kept his eyes on the road, his mind replaying the stories she had told him when he was a boy. Stories about her father waking up before dawn to go to work, about her mother making doses over a wood-fired stove, about monsoon rains flooding the yard and the children splashing barefoot through the water as they drove further. The modern skyline began to fade behind them, replaced by open fields and old brick walls covered in faded advertisements. The rain had slowed, leaving behind a mist that made the air feel heavy with the scent of earth. Sundar could feel the tension building inside him. He wanted this moment to be perfect for her, but he also feared what they might find. What if the house was gone? What if it had been replaced by a cold apartment block or a factory? What if nothing was left? He glanced at his mother again. She was leaning slightly toward the window, her eyes scanning the road like she was searching for something familiar. Her fingers clutched the edge of her shawl, and he noticed the way her breathing had changed. Slower, deeper, almost as if she were bracing herself. Finally, they turned onto a narrow lane. It was lined with houses that looked older than time itself, their walls chipped and worn, doors painted in colors that had faded to soft pastels. Sundar slowed the car to a crawl. A few children played cricket in the rain, their laughter echoing through the lane. A group of women stood outside, chatting as they sorted vegetables into baskets. Every face they passed seemed to carry the same look. Quiet resilience of people who had seen decades of change but never left. "I don't know," Sundar said softly. "We're almost there." She looked at him, her eyes suddenly sharper, alert. "Where are we going, Kana?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. He smiled gently, but didn't answer. Instead, he turned the car into a small clearing where the lane ended. And there it was. The house stood at the far end of the clearing, surrounded by a low stone wall covered in moss. The roof was slanted and tiled, some pieces missing, and the walls were faded a pale yellow. The wooden door looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There was a tree in the courtyard, tall and strong, its branches heavy with leaves. Not a mango tree, but it had the same quiet majesty. Sundar stopped the car and turned to her. This is it. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes locked on the house, her lips slightly parted. Sundar watched as her hand slowly rose to her mouth, her breathing quickening. No, she whispered, almost to herself. No, it can't be. He stepped out of the car, walked around to open her door, and held out his hand. She took it, her grip trembling. As she stepped out, her feet touched the wet ground, and it was as if the years fell away from her. I was born here, she said. Softly, almost like she was speaking to the rain. Sundar nodded. Yes, I found it for you. Her eyes filled with tears. She took a slow step toward the gate, her fingers brushing against the rough stone wall. Every detail seemed to pull her deeper into the past, the crack in the wall near the entrance. The small wooden window to the left, the faint outline of where the old well used to be. They pushed the gate open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the quiet morning. They stepped inside, and the smell of damp wood and earth surrounded them. Her eyes darted everywhere, taking in the courtyard, the tree, the worn stone steps leading to the front door. Then, just as she took another step, she stopped. Her face went pale. Sundar followed her gaze toward the doorway and froze. There was someone standing there, a tall man, dressed in old clothes, his eyes wide as he looked at them. His face was weathered, his hair streaked with gray, and yet there was something familiar in his expression. Sundar could feel his mother's hand tighten around his dot. The man spoke first, his voice deep and unsteady. Who are you? Before Sundar could answer, his mother's knees buckled slightly. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes locked. On the man's face. Sundar reached out to steady her. She didn't look at him. Her voice was a whisper, trembling and broken. That face, it can't be. Her body swayed, and then she collapsed into Sundar's arms. He caught her just before she hit the ground, his heart pounding. He looked up at the man, who was now stepping forward, his own expression unreadable. And in that moment, Sundar knew whatever was inside this house, it was more than just memories. It was something that could change everything. Asterisk. The man at the door, the rain had almost stopped now, leaving the air thick with the smell of wet soil and the faint scent of flowers from somewhere in the courtyard. Sundar's hands were trembling as he held his mother, feeling the weight of her body against him. Her head rested against his chest, her shawl damp from the mist, and for a moment he couldn't tell if she had fainted or if she was just too overwhelmed to stand. He could hear her breathing, shallow, uneven, almost like she was caught between two worlds, one in the present and one far away in her memories. The man at the doorway didn't move closer at first. He stood there as though he, too, had been struck by something he couldn't explain. His eyes were fixed on Sundar's mother, and there was a strange intensity in them, not suspicion, but something deeper, something that felt almost personal. Sundar noticed the way the man's hands gripped the wooden frame of the door, his knuckles pale from the pressure. Please, Sundar said, his voice low but urgent. Can we go inside? She needs to sit down. The man blinked, as if those words had pulled him out of some deep trance. Without speaking, he stepped aside, pushing the door open wider. Sundar carried his mother into the house, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the old stone floor. The air inside was cool and heavy. The faint aroma of incense mixed with the musty scent of time. There was a wooden bench along the wall, its surface smooth from years of use. Sundar gently lowered his mother onto it, crouching down beside her. Amma, can you hear me? He asked softly, brushing damp strands of hair from her forehead. She blinked slowly, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak but couldn't quite find the words. Her eyes, however, were still fixed on the man. Sundar turned to face him fully for the first time. Up close, the man looked older than he had seemed from the gate. There were deep lines around his eyes and mouth, and his skin was tanned from years of working under the sun. His clothes were simple, a faded shirt, loose cotton trousers, and worn sandals. There was an undeniable strength in the way he stood, but also a kind of weariness, as though he carried a heavy burden. I'm sorry for coming here without notice, Sundar began, his voice polite but steady. This is my mother's childhood. Home. She was born here. I thought it might mean something for her to see it again. The man's gaze softened slightly, though he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked back at Sundar's mother and said, What is her name? Radha. Sundar replied at the sound of her name. His mother's head lifted just a little. Her voice was faint, but clear enough. Who are you? The man took a slow step forward. His eyes didn't leave hers. My name is Karthik. The moment that name left his lips, Sundar saw his mother's hand tighten around the edge of her shawl. Her eyes widened, and a single tear slid down her cheek. No, you can't be. Amma, Sundar said, looking between them. Do you know him? She shook her head slightly, though her gaze never wavered from Karthik's face. Karthik was my brother, she whispered, her voice trembling. But he died when he was 17. Sundar felt the air shift in the room. The man's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker of pain, of longing. I didn't die, Karthik said quietly. Radha, it's me. For a few seconds, the world seemed to fall completely silent. Sundar could hear only the faint patter of water dripping somewhere outside. His mind was spinning, trying to understand what he had just heard. This isn't possible, his mother said, shaking her head. We were told you drowned in the river. They brought back your clothes, your bag. We all cried. For you. Her voice broke on the last words, her shoulders shaking. Karta. Ayan took another step forward, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for her. I was swept away. But I didn't drown. I woke up miles downstream in a village I'd never seen before. I was too weak to walk home. Someone took me in, and then things happened. I couldn't find my way back. Years passed. By the time I returned here, everything had changed. The house was empty. I thought all of you were gone. His voice cracked, and he looked away, as if ashamed. Sundar's mother stared at him, her eyes searching his face for the truth. If you are my brother, she said softly, then tell me, what did we bury under the mango tree when we were children? For the first time, a faint smile touched Karthik's lips. A tin box, he said, with your diary and my marbles. Inside, we said we would dig it up when we turned 20. Radha's hand flew to her mouth. A sob escaped her, as she stood on shaky legs, crossing the space between them. Her hands cupped his face, her fingers trembling as they traced the lines of his cheeks. Karthik, she whispered, before pulling him into her arms. The embrace was fierce, desperate, as if both feared the other might vanish again if they let go. Sundar stood quietly, his chest tight, unsure if he should speak or just let the moment be. But even in that reunion, he felt something else brewing in the air. There were too many unanswered questions. Why had Karthik never tried harder to find them? Why was he here, alone, in this old house? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what would they find inside these walls if they stayed long enough? As if sensing Sundar's thoughts, Karthik pulled back slightly from the embrace and looked at him. You should know, he said quietly. There's something in this house you need to see. Something I've kept hidden for a very long time. His voice carried a weight that made Sundar's stomach tighten. What is it? Sundar asked, his tone cautious. Karthik's eyes darkened, and for a moment he seemed to hesitate. Then he glanced at Radha, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. It's about our father. And before Sundar could ask anything more, Karthik turned and began walking deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Sundar looked at his mother, whose face had gone pale again. Emma, he said gently, do you want to follow him? She took a deep breath, clutching his arm. Yes, she whispered. But Sundar, whatever he's about to show us, I'm not sure we're ready for it. Together they stepped into the dim hallway, the wooden door creaking shut behind them. The air inside seemed colder, and the shadows stretched long across the floor. Karthik's figure disappeared around a corner, his voice calling softly for them to come. And in that moment, Sundar knew, whatever they were about to discover, it would change not only his mother's past, but everything he thought he knew about his family. Asterisk, the hidden room hallway was narrow and dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of age and dust. The wooden beams above their heads groaned faintly, as if remembering the weight of decades. Sundar walked beside his mother, his arms steadying her with each step. Every creak of the floor beneath their feet felt like it was pulling them further, away from the world outside and deeper into a place where time had been trapped. Ahead of them, Karthik moved with slow, deliberate steps, his figure half swallowed by the shadows. He didn't look back often, but Sundar could sense the tension in his posture, like someone about to reveal something that had been locked away for too long. As they turned the corner, the hallway opened into a larger room. Sundar stopped for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The room was almost empty except for a few scattered wooden chairs, a small table covered in a faded cloth, and an old oil lamp hanging from the wall. The windows were shut, their glass clouded and streaked, but a faint stream of light pushed through the cracks, illuminating dust particles that danced lazily in the air. His mother's eyes wandered around the room slowly, as though trying to recognize it. This used to be our sitting room, she murmured, her voice filled with disbelief. Amma would sit by that window every morning, reading the newspaper to Appa. Her words trailed off, and Sundar could see her slipping into memory, her gaze fixed on the exact spot where her parents must have sat decades ago. But Karthik didn't stop to linger. He moved to the far corner of the room where a tall wooden cabinet stood against the wall. It was worn, its surface marked with scratches, its once bright varnish now dulled to a lifeless brown. Sundar thought it was just another old piece of furniture until Karthik knelt down beside it and began running his hands along the base. Feeling for something. After a few moments, there was a soft click. Sundar's eyes widened slightly as he saw the cabinet shift forward, just enough to reveal a narrow gap behind it. The sound of wood scraping against the floor echoed through the silent house. "Come," Karthik said quietly, his voice almost swallowed by the stillness. Sundar's mother frowned, stepping closer. "This was never here before," she whispered, confusion clouding her face. "No," Karthik replied. "Appa built it himself. After you left." The words hit like a small jolt. Sundar's mother hesitated, then reached out to touch the edge of the opening. The wood was cold under her fingertips. Inside, behind the cabinet, was a narrow wooden door, barely taller than a child. It was locked with a rusty iron latch, the kind that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Karthik pulled a small key from his pocket and held it for a moment, staring at it as if it carried its own weight of history. Then, without a word, he slid it into the lock. The metal groaned in protest as it turned, the sound echoing in the stillness. When the door finally swung open, the air that spilled out was cool and dry, strangely preserved, untouched by the dampness of the rest of the house. Sundar peered inside, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The space was small, almost like a storage room, but it was filled with stacks of wooden crates, each carefully sealed. Against the far wall stood a trunk, large and bound with thick leather straps. "What is all this?" Sundar asked, his voice hushed. Karthik stepped inside, motioning for them to follow. "After I came back," he began slowly, "I found this room. I don't think anyone outside our family knew about it. I believe Appa built it for a reason." Sundar's mother's eyes scanned the crates, her brow furrowed. "But why hide it?" she asked, her tone heavy with suspicion. Karthik moved to the nearest crate and carefully pried it open. Inside were stacks of papers, letters, receipts, notebooks, all bound neatly with string. Sundar stepped closer and picked one up. The paper was brittle but still readable. His eyes moved over the words and his brow knitted. "These are land documents," he said slowly. "And bank statements." Not just that, Karthik added. There are also letters. Letters addressed to our father from people I've never heard of. Some from here in India. Some from other countries. Sundar's mother stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for one of the letters. She read only the first few lines before her face went pale. These are about debts, she whispered. Large debts. Appa never told us. Karthik nodded grimly. It gets worse. He walked to the large trunk in the corner and, slowly, unfastened the straps. The sound of the buckles coming undone was sharp in the quiet. Then, with a deep breath, he lifted the lid inside, wrapped in layers of cloth. Was something Sundar hadn't expected at all. Stacks of old currency notes, neatly arranged along with small velvet pouches that, when opened, revealed gold coins and jewelry. This is a fortune, Sundar said, his voice low with disbelief. Yes, Karthik replied, and it doesn't belong to us. The words hung in the air like a cold draft. Sundar looked up sharply. What do you mean? Karthik's jaw tightened. From the letters and from what I pieced together, this money was taken from people. Borrowed, promised to be returned, but never repaid. Some of it. I think it was taken without permission at all. His mother's knees seemed to weaken, and she reached for the wall to steady herself. No, she said, her voice breaking. Appa was a good man. He wouldn't. Sundar said gently. But she shook her head, unwilling to hear it. Kartak single quotes, S eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. I wish it wasn't true. I've spent years trying to return what I can, but it's complicated. Some of these people, they're gone now. Some of them left no trace. But I couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. I kept it here, hoping one day someone else in the family would help me make it right. Sundar felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest. He had always imagined his family's past as something simple, rooted in honesty and hard work. Now, that image was cracking. But before he could speak again, Karthik turned toward the far wall of the hidden room. There's one more thing, he said quietly. He reached up and tapped against the wood. A hollow sound echoed back. Then, with a little pressure, a section of the wall swung open like a door. Behind it, in a narrow alcove, was a single wooden box, smaller than the rest, but carved with intricate patterns. K8RTIK didn't open it. Instead, he turned to Sundar and his mother, his eyes unreadable. This, he said slowly, was the last thing Appa hid before he disappeared. The word disappeared landed like a stone in the room. Sundar's mother stared at him. Appa didn't die? She asked, her voice a whisper. Krtik looked at her for a long moment before replying. No, he said, and I think this box will tell us why. But before he could lift the lid, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. Slow, deliberate, and growing closer. All three of them froze. Asterisk the footsteps in the dark first. Just a soft, rhythmic creak, as though the wooden boards in the old hallway were reluctantly giving way beneath a careful weight. But in the heavy stillness of the hidden room, it was deafening. Each step seemed to stretch into forever, a slow drumbeat that made the air inside feel tighter, colder. Sundar's eyes darted to his mother, whose body had gone stiff. Her fingers, still clutching the edge of her shawl, trembled ever so slightly. Karthik, however, remained still. Though Sundar could see the muscle in his jaw tense with each approaching sound, the three of them exchanged a look. No one spoke. Yet the question hung unspoken in the air. Who else could be in the house? Karthik quietly stepped toward the door of the hidden room, his bare feet making no sound against the cool stone floor. Sundar instinctively moved to position himself between his mother and the opening, his protective instincts sharpening in an instant. The footsteps grew louder, now joined by the faint creak of a door hinge somewhere beyond the main hall. And then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. No footsteps, no breath. Just the oppressive stillness, as though the entire house was holding its own air. Sundar's heartbeat seemed to fill the space in place of the sound. Thudding so loudly in his ears, he wondered if the others could hear it. Tit raised a hand, signaling for them to wait. He took a slow step into the outer room, his shoulders rigid, his eyes scanning the shadows. Sundar followed at a distance, careful not to let his mother out of his reach. Then, without warning, the silence shattered, the sharp crash of something falling in the next room made Sundar's mother gasp softly. Sundar's hands clenched into fists as he moved closer to Karthik, who was now peering around the doorway that led deeper into the house. "Stay here," Karthik whispered, though. His tone carried the weight of someone who knew his instruction would not be followed. Sundar shook his head once. "I'm coming," he murmured together. They stepped into the hallway, the faint light from a distant window casting long shadows along the walls. The floorboards beneath them creaked under their weight, answering the footsteps they'd heard moments earlier. They passed through a narrow corridor lined with old photographs, sepia-toned images of people long gone, staring down at them with eyes that seemed to hold secrets. And then they reached the source of the sound, an old chair, lay tipped over in the center of what must have once been the dining room. Beside it on the floor was a small bundle of cloth. At first glance, it looked like discarded rags, but as Sundar stepped closer, he realized it was a scarf, a woman's scarf, embroidered with delicate flowers. Its edges frayed with age. His mother's sharp intake of breath made him turn toward her. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the scarf, as if it were a ghost. That belonged to Amma," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. K.A. crouched down, lifting the scarf gently. The fabric was damp, though from the rain or from something else, Sundar couldn't tell. "Someone's been here," Karthik said, his voice low but certain. "Recently." Before they could respond, the faint sound of a door closing, this time from the front of the house, echoed toward them. Sundar's instincts kicked in. He moved quickly toward the sound, his footsteps measured but fast, weaving through the narrow passageways until he reached the main entrance. The wooden door was shut, but the latch hung loosely, swaying slightly as if it had just been released. He pulled it open and stepped outside, scanning the small courtyard. The rain had begun again, soft but steady, pattering against the stone. The clearing beyond the gate was empty. No movement, no figure slipping away into the mist. Just the silence of a place that had seen too much behind him. His mother's voice called out softly, "Sundar, come back inside." When he returned to the dining room, Karthik was holding the scarf in one hand and the small wooden box in the other. His face was pale, though his expression was firm. "We can't ignore this anymore," he said. "We have to open it now." His mother hesitated, her eyes flicking between the box and the scarf. What if it tells us something we don't want to know?" she asked, quietly. Kartak, single quotes. S gaze softened, but his tone was resolute. "And, we've already stepped into the past. Whether we like it or not, it's here with us. And I have a feeling this box holds the key to everything, not just about Appa, but about why someone was in this house today." Sundar took a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the box. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost wrong given the tension in the room, carved with delicate patterns of vines and flowers, the wood polished smooth by careful hands. There was no lock, just a simple latch holding it shut. Kart placed it on the table between them. "Once we open this," he said, "there's no going back." For a long moment, no one moved. Outside, the rain picked up, its rhythm pressing against the roof like a heartbeat. Sundar's mother slowly reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the box. And then she lifted the latch. The lid creaked open, and the smell of aged paper and something faintly metallic drifted out. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all tied together with a faded red ribbon. But tucked beneath them was something that caught the dim light and gleamed faintly. A small brass key, worn from years of handling. Sundar picked it up, feeling its weight. "What's this for?" he asked. Krt, single quotes, S eyes darkened. "I think It might open the locked chest in Appa's old room, the one even I couldn't find a key for. His mother's voice was barely more than a whisper. And what's in that chest? Karthik looked at her, then at Sundar, and for the first time, his voice faltered. If I'm right, it might explain why Appa left, and it might tell us who's here just now. They all turned toward the hallway that led to the far end of the house, the part of the home none of them had entered yet. The air there seemed darker somehow, as if it knew they were coming, and as they took their first steps toward it, the wind outside howled suddenly, rattling the windows and making the shadows on the walls dance like restless spirits. Asterisk the chest. In the canal, the hallway to the far end of the house felt different from the rest. The air was cooler, heavier, as though it had not been disturbed for decades. The walls here were bare, stripped of photographs or decoration, and each step they took seemed to echo longer, as if the house itself was listening. Sundar could feel his mother's grip tighten on his arm as they moved forward. She was breathing, a little faster now, her eyes scanning the shadows, as though afraid that any corner might hold a memory she wasn't ready to face. Karta. Ik led the way, the small brass key clutched firmly in his hand. His shoulders were tense, his pace steady but not rushed. Sundar noticed how his brother-uncle glanced at the closed doors they passed without opening them, as though he already knew exactly where they were going. Finally, they reached the last door at the end of the corridor. It was heavier than the others, made of solid teak, the surface darkened and cracked with age. The handle was brass, its shine dulled to a faint patina, but it still held a faint warmth when Sundar reached out to touch it. This was Appa's room. His mother whispered, her voice breaking slightly on the word, Appa. Karthik looked at her with quiet sympathy before turning the handle. The door opened slowly, groaning on its hinges as a wave of cool, stale air drifted out. Inside. The room was dim, the only light coming from a narrow window partially blocked by wooden shutters. Dust floated in the air, stirred by their presence. The scent here was stronger, a mix of wood, old paper, and something faintly metallic. The kind of smell that clings to a place when it has been sealed for too long. The furniture was minimal. A sturdy wooden bed with a thin mattress, a small desk pushed against the wall, and a tall wardrobe in the corner. But Sundar's eyes were immediately drawn to the far side of the room, where an old wooden chest sat against the wall. It was large, bound in tarnished iron bands, and its lock was shaped to fit the very key Karthik now held. Asterisk, they all stood before it in silence for a moment. Sundar could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Not just the weight of the chest itself, but of whatever truth it held. Ik knelt before the lock, his hand steady as he inserted the key. The sound of the tumblers clicking. Open seemed unnaturally loud. He glanced up at Sundar and Radha before turning it fully. With a final metallic snap, the lock came free. Asterisk. The lid lifted with surprising ease, revealing its contents. Inside, the chest was divided into sections, each carefully arranged. The first thing they saw were more letters, but unlike the ones in the wooden box. These were written in their father's unmistakable handwriting. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. Radha reached for the top one, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly, then widened. These are confessions, she said, her voice a mix of shock and disbelief. Appa was writing about the money. He admitted it. He knew what he did was wrong. Sundar leaned over to read with her. The words were painfully clear. Their father wrote about debts he had taken from neighbors, about investments that had failed, about how pride had stopped him from admitting the truth to his family. But there's more, Karthik said quietly, lifting a leather-bound journal from the chest. He flipped it open, revealing pages filled with careful writing. This is his diary, and it says he was being threatened. Sundar's head jerked toward him. By who? Karthik turned the journal toward them, pointing to a name that appeared repeatedly. Rajan. Rajan, Rida repeated, her voice dropping. I know that name. He was a businessman in the area when we were young. Everyone feared him. There were rumors, Bet he dealt with criminals. Karthik nodded. Appa wrote that Rajan found out about the money. He wasn't interested. In repayment, he wanted more. He demanded that Appa work for him, using his skills and connections to cover up illegal deals. When Appa refused, Rajan threatened to harm the family. The room seemed to grow colder. Sundar could almost hear the unspoken conclusion forming. In his mother's mind, that their father's disappearance wasn't a choice, but a desperate act to protect them. But then Karthik reached deeper into the chest and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He set it on the floor and unwrapped it, revealing a photograph. The photograph was creased and faded, but the image was clear enough. Their father, standing beside a much younger man in front of a car. Sundar's breath caught. The younger man was unmistakably the same person they had seen in the courtyard earlier that day. The intruder. Sundar said quietly. Yes, Karthik replied. And look at the date written on the back. Radha turned the photograph over. The date was 15 years after their father had supposedly vanished. Her voice cracked. This means he was alive all those years. Sundar's thoughts were spinning. And that man, he knew him. Maybe he still knows where he is. Before anyone could say more, his mother gasped. She had reached into another compartment of the chest and pulled out a small box, much smaller than the one in the hidden room. She opened it, revealing a silver locket. Inside was a tiny photograph, a younger Radha and Karthik, side by side, smiling at the camera. On the opposite side of the locket was a note written in their father's hand. For my children, when it is safe. Radha's eyes filled with tears. He never forgot us, she whispered. KRT Cox single quotes. S gaze was steady but troubled. No. But if Rajan is still alive, he may be the reason we've been watched today. The reason someone came into this house. The rain outside began to beat harder against the shutters, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked sharply. The sound was followed by something else, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on wet gravel. Moving toward the house, all three of them turned toward the window. They're back. Karthik said quietly, the truth in the rain. Sound of footsteps outside was steady. Unhurried and somehow more unnerving than a hurried escape would have been. Whoever was approaching wasn't afraid. They were coming with purpose. The three of them stood frozen in the dim room, the chest still open at their feet, its contents exposed like an open wound. The rain drummed harder against the roof, and a gust of wind rattled the shutters, making the flicker of the lone lamp waver and stretch shadows across their faces. Karthik's eyes met Sundar's in a silent exchange, a wordless agreement that whatever was about to happen, they would face it together. Sundar's mother, however, had instinctively stepped back toward the corner of the room, her shawl drawn tightly around her, as though she could shield herself from the moment. Sundar moved closer to her, a protective barrier, while Karthik walked. To the doorway, his body tense, ready. The footsteps reached the wooden veranda, and then came the slow, deliberate creak of the front door. It opened without a knock. A figure stepped inside. It was the same man Sundar had glimpsed earlier, tall, broad-shouldered, his clothes damp from the rain. Now that Sundar could see him clearly, he noticed the sharpness in his features, the way his eyes seemed to scan the room in a single sweep before settling on the three of them. There was no fear in his expression, only a kind of weary authority. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence. Then the man said, in a deep, measured voice, "You shouldn't have opened that chest." Sundar's grip on his mother's shoulder tightened. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low but steady. The man took a slow step forward. "My name is Anil," he said. "I was a friend of your father's." Karthik's eyes narrowed. "Friend? I saw you in that photograph. You knew he was alive years after we thought he was gone. Where is he now?" Anil's gaze shifted, lingering briefly on Radha before returning to Karthik. "That depends on what you mean by where." The vague answer made Sundar's jaw tighten. Stop speaking in riddles. "We've spent the whole day uncovering secrets about him, about debts, threats, Rajan. If you know something, say it." Anil's expression hardened slightly, but there was also a flicker of something else, regret, maybe even guilt. Your father was a good man, he began, but he made mistakes. Rajan was not the kind of enemy you could negotiate with. When your father refused to work for him, Rajan set a trap. He made it look like your father had stolen from him so that the police would hunt him too. It forced your father to run. Radha's voice broke through, trembling but firm. And you? Where were you in all this? Anil lowered his head for a moment before answering. I was his driver at first. But when things went bad, I became his messenger. I brought him news about the family. I told him when it was safe to come near the village, but it never was. Rajan had men everywhere. Karthik took a step forward. So, why now? Why come here today? Anil's eyes moved to the open chest. Because Rajan is dead, he said simply. He died 2 weeks ago, and your father wanted you to have what's inside that chest before anyone else found it. The words hit the room like a stone dropped in still water. Sundar felt his breath catch. He's alive? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Anil nodded once. But he's old now, weak. He didn't want to bring danger to your door. So he stayed away even after Rajan was gone. But when he heard you were looking for this house, he asked me to watch, to make sure you could see what he left for you. Radha's eyes were brimming with tears. Then take us to him, she sighed, her voice trembling. Please, I need to see him before it's too late. Anil hesitated, then glanced toward the window where the rain still fell in sheets. He's not far. But the road isn't easy, especially in this weather. If we go now? Sundar didn't even look at Karthik. Both men nodded at the same time. The next hour was a blur of movement. They locked the chest again, taking only the locket and a handful of letters. Anil led them out of the house through the rain-slick lane and into a jeep parked under a banyan tree. The engine roared to life, and they drove into the mist-shrouded countryside, the narrow road twisting between fields and groves. Finally, they stopped before a small weathered cottage, its roof patched with tin sheets, smoke curling from a crooked chimney. Anil got out first, motioning for them to follow inside. The air was warm from a small fire. And there, sitting in an old armchair near the hearth, was a man whose face had been etched by years and hardship. His hair was white, his frame thinner than Sundar had imagined, but his eyes were the same as in the photographs, sharp, kind, and unyielding. Radha froze in the doorway, her breath catching. The old man looked up, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Then his lips curved into the faintest smile. Radha, he said, his voice rough with age but unmistakable. Radha crossed the room in 3 unsteady steps, falling to her knees beside him. Appa! Sundar watched as she held her father's hands, her tears falling freely. Karthik stood silently, his jaw clenched, his own eyes shining. Their father looked at each of them in turn. I am sorry, he said softly, for everything. I cannot be. For every moment I wasn't there. But every day I prayed you would be safe. There were 1,000 questions, but none of them seemed as important as the fact that they were here together, even if only for whatever time was left outside. The rain began to ease, the clouds breaking just enough for a sliver of sunlight to touch the wet earth. And in that small weathered room, a family long broken by distance and secrets began slowly to feel whole again. Asterisk.